He is known to history because he was vice president, but it was as Senate Majority Leader that he wielded real power. He knew Teddy Roosevelt, Charles Lindbergh, and Will Rogers. He came not from wealth and influence, but from pioneering entrepreneurs. His life spanned 2 worlds and 2 centuries, and he struggled to find his place. He belonged to us. He was our Charley.
Charles Curtis was born in 1860 in North Topeka to a French and Indian mother and a white father.
Through Charley's father's family, the Curtis family goes way back to the Pilgrims and is clearly a family that's moving westward over the 250 years leading to Kansas Territory. They're consistently a pioneering family.
He was an Indian. I read that he was an 8th Kaw. You know, my feeling is it doesn't matter how much percentage of an Indian blood you have, you're an Indian. Now, whether you choose to be an Indian or if you choose a different life, that's up to you.
On Charley's mother's side, he's not only an Indian, but he's almost royalty. His great-great-grandfather is White Plume, who traveled to Washington in the 1820s and visited with President James Monroe. He's also descended from Pawhuska and has Potawatomi blood in addition to much French blood, many of the French trappers and traders having become very connected to the Kaw tribe in the years 1820 to about 1850.
Growing up a mixed blood in the 19th century would have been difficult for anybody. Being on the frontier might have added a few challenges to that.
Charles Curtis is born in 1860 in Kansas Territory, so that's unique in many ways, but one way is that he's born right in the firestorm of the beginning of the Civil War. And so his entire formative years are in the midst of the conflict that's going to tear the nation apart.
At one time, the Kaws had control of about 20 million acres of hunting ground, along with the Osage. So in 1825, Chief White Plume, who was the great-great-grandfather of Charles Curtis, signed a treaty along with a lot of other Native American tribes. They called it the Treaty of St. Louis. And that deeded out 18 million acres of ground to the United States government. And in 1845, that treaty ran out. They had been on a 2 million acre piece of ground for 20 years. Then they moved them to a 20 by 20 mile square reservation, about 256,000 acres of ground, right smack dab in the worst possible spot they could, right on the Santa Fe Trail, with a little settlement called Council Grove.
When Charley was 3 years old, his mother died. So Charley went to live with his paternal grandmother in Topeka until he was 5. Then he went to the Kaw Reservation near Council Grove and stayed with his mother's parents.
After the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, that opened up this area for settlement. And they had a lot of illegal squatters settling on the reservation. So in 1859, the citizens of Council Grove decided they wanted to become an incorporated town. To solve that, the government had to take away some more ground. They went from 20 by 20 mile square reservation down to a 9 by 14. Left Kansas with about 80,000 acres of ground, and they built 138 stone houses. They were put on 40-acre pieces of ground. And the Kansai were told that you would assimilate. You'll live in these houses, you're going to farm, and you're going to become just like the white Europeans. Well, there were a lot of problems.
Charley's mother's family, the Pappins, were very involved in the ferry boat operations, and it became an incredibly lucrative operation as well. And I think to a large extent it also became a multicultural operation because they were meeting all kinds of people of all kinds of races. And so they had to learn how to deal with people in many different ways. And as we know, Charley himself will speak 3 languages. And so it's a thing where it really does move you up in the world in more ways than just economics.
When he was 8 years old, the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers venture much farther east than normal to attack their old enemy, the Kaw.
The winter of 1867, the Kansai were on their bison hunt out around Ellsworth, and a group of Cheyenne approached. Everything was very friendly. When they departed, the Cheyenne came across one lone Kaw herdsman and attacked him and killed him and scalped him within sight of the Kaw village, which enraged the Kansai. They got on their horses and a battle ensued, and the Kansai got the upper hand, killed about 13 or 14 Cheyenne. So the Cheyenne are out there just brewing over this, wanting revenge. So finally they came to Council Grove.
Young Charley came to Topeka to tell the governor of their plight. Now there are two accounts of that story. One account says that he came by himself. In fact, that's the story that he would recount years later when newspapers interviewed him. Another story says that his uncle, Joe Jim, made the trip and Charley went with him. By either account, he comes to Topeka to tell then Governor Samuel Crawford that the Kaw are under attack.
So the government begins to almost decide which Indians are friendly and which ones are not. And that comes in the form of almost identifying who are the savage Indians. And of course, the savage Indians are those who want to live independently and freely, sadly. And in many cases, those who will go along with government decrees are the friendly Indians, or those who unfortunately will become dependent upon the government, partly because they're doing what they're told and trying to do the right thing. And so it's a sad collision. And what we miss in all that is the collision amongst Indians themselves. There's a feeling that anyone who actually did what the government asked is a sellout and is cheap. And the Kaw, unfortunately, being very obedient and very good and looking for help for 50 years, sometimes get put in that classification of a dependent or a sellout. And I don't think that's necessarily correct or just.
If you read the newspaper articles from that time period, it's horrible. They talk very bad about the Kansai. The Kaw's not using this ground, they shouldn't have it, but they owned it. I mean, the government had signed a treaty, it belonged to them.
You've already had the Indian Removal Act of 1830, so it's very clear that the government is going to be involved in Indian relocation if they don't go willingly. And by the 1860s, we have the military very much involved in making sure that happens. In fact, when the Civil War ends, guess what? We got a lot of soldiers that have some free time. And so they're going to move these Indians one way or the other.
In fact, Charley's dad is one of those soldiers serving under former Governor, then Colonel Samuel Crawford, in the 19th Kansas when he goes to join Custer in the Washita campaign. So Orrin Curtis, through most of Charley's childhood, is off fighting somewhere, somebody.
Curtis's father, known as Captain Jack during the Civil War, was not necessarily a good guy. He rode with the Redlegs, which the Redlegs, the 7th Kansas Cavalry, under Charles Jennison, were guys who did things they should not have done. War became for them a war of spoils, a war of collecting the wrong kind of things rather than just winning the war. And he was involved in that, including being court-martialed along with Jennison and others. And so he did not exhibit an amazing behavior throughout his time in the service. And then he hangs on and stays on into the Indian Wars. And it's even more difficult to identify who are we fighting? What is the purpose of the fighting now? And so that's the legacy that Curtis inherits. And in many ways, it's an amazing thing that Charles Curtis rises to the heights that he does with that sort of a father.
One of the photographs we have in one of our displays has a picture of Native Americans being basically told that they're going to be removed to Oklahoma. And in that picture is 3 Kansai chiefs, and right in the middle was a gentleman kind of hidden behind an arm, but I thought, that's Captain Jack. And at the bottom it says Captain Curtis. And here we have a man who was the father of the future vice president, and here he is helping the United States government boot him out.
Charley said that when he was 8 years old and the Cheyenne attacked the Kaw, that was when he first chose the white man's world. That may not be exactly accurate. It may have been his grandmother that chose the white man's world for him. Parmelia Curtis, in the relative safety of Topeka, decided that if the Kaw reservation was going to be attacked by marauding Indian tribes, that maybe her grandson wasn't quite safe there. It was her decision that he come back to Topeka and stay at the time.
Almost immediately after the Civil War, what was once the conflict of the Civil War is now the conflict of the Indian Wars, front and center in Kansas. We think of places like Little Bighorn in Montana and the Dakota reservations and places like that, but the truth is it started in Kansas in many ways. There's 30, 40, 50 forts that will be built in the next 6 or 8 years. Trail lines, railroad lines, all these things need to be protected. Settlers are scared, people are captured, kidnapped. So it's a very, very tumultuous period, and Curtis and the Kaw are right in the heart of all of that.
So in 1873 was the final year that they were on this reservation. Chief Olgawahu, who was the head chief at that time, tried and tried to save his people, but they had been shoved from one place to the other until they were shoved completely out of the state that was named after them.
And it was a horrible, horrible trail of tears for them. A lot of their people starved, had smallpox, didn't have food to eat. It was very bad.
He wanted to go with his family, of course. Who wouldn't? You know, he missed his maternal grandmother. The life of the Kaw on the open plains had a lot more appeal than being a schoolboy in Topeka.
His Indian grandmother encouraged him to go live with his other grandparents, to get an education, to have a better life. I think she probably knew what life was going to be like moving to Indian Territory, and the love for her grandson. She encouraged him, even though it probably broke her heart, she encouraged him to stay there and have a good life.
He said that his grandmother Pappan told him she loved him above everything, and how difficult it must have been for her to send that grandchild away, not knowing when she would see him again. It's hard for us in present day to imagine how difficult communication was, how difficult travel was. So she is truly acting in his best interest when she tells him to stay with his white grandmother in Topeka. A really difficult decision.
Many years later, Charles Curtis looked back at his youth, and he remembered at the age of 13 very much feeling adrift in the world. He was stuck between two cultures, an Indian culture and a white culture, and whereas in the past those cultures were only a few miles apart, now his Indian family would be headed to Oklahoma, his white family would be in Kansas still, and where would he go? Where did he belong? What was really home? He was all Indian and he was all white, and he was stuck.
That probably was the biggest turning point in his life, and that is probably where he truly chooses the white man's world.
At one point in Charles Curtis's life, he said that he was glad that he had forgotten the Kaw language that had been a big part of his youth and early childhood. Did he really believe that? I don't think so. Was he really, truly not wanting to be connected to that grandmother that he loved so much, that he said was the most important woman in his life? I don't think so. But he was a man who wanted to be an American, and he wanted to acculturate like so many others had to do, ones that were coming across the ocean and ones that were coming from all over. He wanted to be an American. He was about to run, and he was running for some of the highest offices in our nation, and he needed to be viewed, and even in his own heart, he needed to be viewed as an American.
It's always been in my heart, and I think most Native Americans will always have that in their heart. Now, whether they go out and dance in the arena, you don't have to do that to prove you're an Indian. You know, it's a matter of feeling, and I think the idea that God created you to be an Indian. He created people, the different ethnics He created. You need to keep that close to your heart.